Have you ever had one of those nights where you're lying in bed, the house is quiet, and your body is tired, but your mind? Your mind is wide awake. You stare at the ceiling, maybe glance at the clock. It's 3 a.m., and you're thinking about something that happened months, maybe even years ago. A moment you thought was behind you. A conversation that didn't go right. A goodbye you weren't ready for. And somehow, it's playing again in your head, like it just happened yesterday. You tell yourself, come on, just forget it. It's in the past. But your brain doesn't seem to care. The thought keeps looping. Again and again. You know it's not helping, but it's like the thought has a life of its own. And here you are, awake, frustrated, and wondering, why can't I just let this go? If this sounds familiar, you're not alone. And more importantly, you're not broken. There's actually a reason your mind keeps pulling you back to what hurt you, and once you understand it, you can begin to loosen its grip. Let's talk about something most people never learn until much later in life, if at all. Obsession, that constant mental pull towards something painful, doesn't start as a mistake. It starts as a strategy. In fact, it was once how your mind protected you. You see, long before we had smartphones or even language, our ancestors survived by remembering threats. The human who forgot where the lion attacked didn't live long enough to pass on their genes. But the one who replayed that danger, who stayed alert and couldn't stop thinking about it, that person survived. Obsession helped them stay alive. So the brain evolved to fixate on pain, not to punish us, but to protect us. If something hurt, your brain wanted you to remember it, study it, learn from it, and never let it happen again. The only problem? The threats today are no longer lions or tigers. Now the threats are emotional, rejection, loss, embarrassment, being left out. And your brain, bless its heart, treats those things like a life or death situation. Think about it. When someone walks away without explanation or something important ends before you're ready, it feels like your mind won't stop circling the same thought. You replay the conversation. You imagine what you could have said. You search for clues. You try to solve it like a mystery. But nothing changes and you end up feeling worse. That circling has a name. It's called rumination. And it's not the same as problem solving. Problem solving moves forward. Rumination spins in place. It's like your brain is on a treadmill, working hard, getting nowhere. And here's something most people don't realize. The more you think about a painful memory, the more your brain believes it must be important. Repetition strengthens your brain's pathways. Just like a trail in the forest becomes clearer the more you walk it, your thoughts become habits the more you think them. So even if you don't want to obsess, your brain has been trained to go there. There's a fascinating psychological principle that helps explain this. It's called the Zeigarnik Effect. Researchers found that people tend to remember unfinished tasks more vividly than completed ones. Think of a story that ended with no explanation or a relationship that just vanished. You don't get closure. And because your mind can't close the file, it keeps reopening it. This is why your brain keeps dragging you back to that one conversation, that one decision, that one loss. It's not because you want to relive the pain. It's because your brain is trying to finish something that can't be finished. Let's take an example. Imagine a friend you were once close to. Maybe they stopped calling, or one day things just shifted. No big fight, no goodbye, just silence. You told yourself to move on, but their name still pops into your head. Out of the blue. You wonder what went wrong. You wonder if it was something you said. And even though years may have passed, part of you is still standing at the door, waiting for it to open again. That's the Zeigarnik Effect in action. Your brain hates loose ends. It would rather have a painful answer than no answer at all. So it makes one up. They left because I wasn't enough. I must have done something wrong. They never really cared. These thoughts hurt, but they feel certain. And the brain prefers painful certainty over confusing silence. But there's another twist. When you try to stop thinking about someone or something, it often has the opposite effect. Psychologists call it thought suppression, And it works like this. The more you try not to think about something, the more attention you give it. Like trying not to look at a red balloon in a white room. Suddenly, it's all you can see. Maybe you've told yourself, don't think about that mistake. Or, don't think about them anymore. But what happens? You check to see if the thought is still there. And by checking, you keep it alive. It's like trying to put out a fire by staring at it harder. This is why well-meaning advice like, just forget it, rarely helps. Your brain doesn't work that way. And the more you try to push something away, the more power it gains. But here's the good news. And I really want you to hear this. Just because your brain has trained itself to go back to the pain doesn't mean you're stuck there forever. You can retrain it. Just like you can learn a new habit at 20, you can learn one at 60, 70, or beyond. Your brain is still flexible. You still have the power to shape it. And the first step is understanding that your obsession isn't really about the event. It's about the emotion underneath. You don't obsess about the date that went well. You think of it, smile, and move on. But the one that ended without explanation, the job rejection that hit a little too deep, the friend who stopped calling, those linger. Not because you enjoy suffering, but because there's an emotion inside that hasn't been processed. Maybe it's grief. Maybe it's shame. Maybe it's a feeling of not being enough, not being seen, not being heard. When something in the present pokes at a wound from the past, your brain doesn't just react to now, it reacts to then. That's why these thoughts feel so big, so heavy, so hard to move past. It's not just the memory that's sticking, it's the feeling. And that feeling is asking to be understood, not fixed, not rushed. Just gently acknowledged. So if you've ever wondered, why does this still bother me? The answer might be simpler than you think, because something inside you still needs care. Not judgment, not shame, just care. Now, once we begin to understand that obsession is more about emotion than the actual event, things begin to shift. It's like realizing you've been treating a symptom instead of the real cause. And here's where it gets even more powerful. Once we stop blaming ourselves for being too sensitive or too stuck, we can finally start healing. Let me ask you this. Have you ever gone to look up someone on Facebook or search an old photo, just out of curiosity, and then suddenly find yourself scrolling for 30 minutes, heart heavy, wondering what they're doing now? Maybe it's an ex, a friend you lost touch with, a child who pulled away. You didn't mean to fall into it. But somehow, there you are, comparing their life to yours, wondering if they've moved on or if they even think about you at all. This is the modern trap. Something our ancestors never had to deal with. Social media has given us a window into the very people we're trying to move on from. And every time we peek through that window, we feed the loop. We may call it checking, but what we're really doing is reopening the wound before it can even begin to heal. When you can see their smile, read their words, guess at the meaning behind a photo, your brain doesn't register that it's just pixels on a screen. It feels real. It feels current. It feels like the story is still going. And as long as your mind believes the story isn't finished, it will keep pulling you back in. That's why it's so hard to stop looking. Your brain thinks, maybe there's something I missed. Maybe this post will give me the answer. Maybe if I just keep watching, I'll understand. But understanding isn't what really happens. What happens is more circling, more guessing, more hurting. And here's the truth no one likes to say out loud. Sometimes, there is no answer. No closure. No final explanation that makes everything okay. And that's where obsession struggles the most. Because it doesn't know what to do with silence. It wants a neat ending. A reason. But some chapters just end without one. When we can't get resolution from the outside world, the work has to happen inside us. And that work starts with a very honest question, one most of us never think to ask. What am I avoiding by staying stuck in this loop? Because obsession, for all the pain it causes, can feel safer than uncertainty. As long as we're thinking about the past, we don't have to face the present. We don't have to feel the full weight of grief. We don't have to sit in the silence. We don't have to risk being hurt again. We get to stay busy, even if we're not going anywhere. It's kind of like rocking in a chair. Lots of movement, but no forward motion. That's the hidden truth about obsession. It's often not just about what happened. It's about what we don't want to feel right now. Loneliness, emptiness, regret, fear, uncertainty about what comes next. These emotions can feel like too much, especially if you've been carrying them alone for years. So the mind, trying to protect you, says, let's just keep thinking about what happened. Let's try to solve it one more time. But healing never comes from solving the past. It comes from returning to the present. Now, this doesn't mean you have to just move on overnight. In fact, real healing is never that fast. But it does mean you have a choice, a powerful one, about where your attention goes. Here's something psychologists call metacognition. It simply means being aware of what your mind is doing without getting swept away by it. You don't have to fight the thought. You don't have to judge it. You just notice it and name it. This is the loop about why they left. This is the memory that pulls me in. This is the fear of not being enough. Just by naming the thought, you create space between you and it. And in that space is your freedom. You're no longer caught inside the storm. You're standing beside it, watching it pass. This is also where mindfulness comes in. And I don't mean sitting in a cave or chanting for hours. I mean simply bringing your attention back to the present moment, gently, again and again. Because the present is the only place the obsession doesn't live. Obsession lives in the past, what happened, what was said, what you wish you could change. Or it lives in the future, what they might be doing now, what might happen if you reach out again. But right here, right now, in this exact moment, you're safe. You're breathing. You're okay. The more you bring your focus back to the now, the weaker those old pathways become. Your brain starts building new ones. The pull starts to loosen. This is why small practices, like going for a mindful walk, gardening with full attention, or even washing dishes while noticing the water, can begin to shift your brain. You're telling your nervous system, we're not in danger anymore. We don't have to chase the pain. Now, you might be thinking, that sounds good, but it still hurts. And that's okay. Let it hurt. Let the emotion move through you. Remember, it's not the pain itself that traps us. It's the resistance to feeling it. When you allow the sadness, the grief, the disappointment to pass through like a wave, you're doing the most powerful healing work of all. Because here's what obsession is really asking for: to be seen, to be heard, to be held, not pushed away. And when you can hold that part of yourself with kindness, the need to fix everything begins to fade. If you've been caught in a mental loop that's lasted months or even years, please know this: you are not weak. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are a human being with a powerful, protective brain that just hasn't been given new instructions. But it's not too late. Not at 60. Not at 70. Not ever. Healing doesn't mean you forget. It means you remember without falling apart. It means you choose to live in today, even when the past still knocks sometimes. And every time you choose presence over replay, every time you breathe through a thought instead of following it, every time you ask yourself what you need instead of what you should have done, you are healing. You are taking your power back from something that never deserved to keep it. It's a strange thing, isn't it? How a single memory can stay alive in the back of your mind for years, while so many other moments fade. You can forget where you left your keys or what you had for breakfast, but that one moment, that conversation, that look, that goodbye, stays sharp, even when everything else gets blurry. But now you know why. It's not weakness. It's not stubbornness. It's your brain doing what it was trained to do. Hold on to pain so it can protect you from more of it. It means you're human, and that your mind is trying to help in the only way it knows how. But here's where everything begins to change. When you stop trying to erase the thought and start learning to live beside it without letting it run your life. Because obsession, as exhausting and painful as it can be, is often a signal, a sign that something deeper wants your attention. And when we ignore it or try to fight it away, we miss the chance to actually listen to what it's trying to tell us. Now here's something we often overlook. Most of our obsessive thoughts aren't really about that person or that event. Not fully. They're about something it touched inside us. A deeper place. A much older wound. Maybe the silence from your grown child brought back the feeling of being left out when you were younger. Maybe being rejected in love stirred up a sense of not being good enough that's been there for decades. Maybe the failure you can't stop thinking about reawakened a fear that you've been carrying quietly for most of your life. This is the part that many people don't talk about, but it matters. You see, when a present experience hits a past pain, your brain doesn't just react to what's in front of you, it reacts to the whole history. And that's why the feeling is often way bigger than the situation seems to justify. That's why logical advice from well-meaning friends like "just let it go" or "move on" rarely helps. Because they're speaking to the surface, while you're experiencing the depth. That's why some people keep ending up in similar patterns over and over again. They keep obsessing over new people, new disappointments, new situations, not because they love the drama, but because the wound hasn't been acknowledged. And until it is, the mind will keep chasing the next thing that looks like the last thing, hoping for a different ending. But here's the beautiful truth. The healing doesn't come from getting a better outcome next time. The healing comes from finally sitting with yourself and saying, "I see you, I hear you, and you don't have to keep fighting this battle alone anymore." Because when we stop focusing on who or what hurt us and start gently exploring why it hurt so much, we begin to reclaim our story. And part of that story, the one few want to face, is grief. Grief is a quiet companion to obsession. It's often the piece we don't allow ourselves to fully feel. Because to grieve means to accept. To grieve means to admit the chapter won't be rewritten, the ending won't be changed, the conversation won't be had. And that's hard, it's heartbreaking even. Because letting go means facing the truth that the story may not continue the way you once hoped. But without grief, we stay stuck in a loop. Because grief, even with its heaviness, moves. Obsession circles. And real healing requires movement. So if you find yourself still thinking about the one that walked away, the words you wish you could take back, the apology you never received, ask yourself, have I really let myself grieve? Not just the person or the moment, but the hope that went with it. The future you imagined. The story you were writing in your heart. And then, give yourself permission to mourn it. Privately, gently, with compassion. Because you're not weak for hurting. You're strong for loving that deeply in the first place. Now here's something else that may surprise you. Obsession can also be a way of avoiding what's happening now. It can feel easier to live in yesterday's pain than to face today's uncertainty. Especially as we grow older, when change feels more constant and loss becomes more familiar. Some people stay in the loop because it gives them a sense of purpose, of connection, even if it hurts. Because stepping outside of it means facing a blank page, and that can feel scarier than staying in the old chapter. But the blank page isn't your enemy. It's your invitation to write something new, not to erase what came before, but to build something beside it, something rooted in who you are now, not who you were then. And the way forward isn't always dramatic. It can start small, like choosing not to check their profile today, like stepping outside for a walk when the loop begins, like noticing the thought and saying, "Ah, there you are again," instead of getting pulled in. Like focusing on the one part of the day that felt peaceful instead of replaying the part that hurt. Each time you do that, you're giving your brain new instructions. You're building a new path, one step at a time. Over time, those old grooves soften. The thought still shows up, but it doesn't grip you the same way. The ache gets quieter. The weight lifts little by little. And one day, without even realizing it, you'll find that the story no longer controls you. You'll remember it, but you won't relive it. And if you ever catch yourself wondering, Why can't I stop thinking about this? Try asking a new question. What am I afraid to face if I do stop thinking about this? Because often when the obsession quiets, something else rises. Silence, emptiness, stillness. And in that stillness is the place where healing begins. That stillness is not a void, it's the space where you return. You don't have to rush. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be willing. Willing to notice the thought without feeding it. Willing to sit with discomfort without running from it. Willing to trust that healing is still possible even after all this time. And I want to leave you with this. You are not broken because you remember. You are not weak because you care. You are not stuck because something hurts. You are simply human. With a brain that's doing its best. With a heart that's been through more than most people know. And with a life that still holds so much meaning, even in the middle of uncertainty. So take a breath, let go of the need to have all the answers, and give yourself permission to begin again. Not by erasing what was, but by choosing what comes next. Here's to you, still growing, still healing, still living with courage and grace. And if this video touched something in you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. You never know who else might need to hear what you've been through. And if you found comfort here, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Strong Elderly Life for more gentle, empowering conversations like this. Because here, we believe it's never too late to feel whole again. Take care of yourself. You matter. And you are never alone.